Welcome back to Winning Isn't Easy. We have as a special guest Dr. Keller, and now we're going to switch gears a little bit and talk about the CPET in the context of long-term disability. I've got a number of questions for you. So why is the CPET considered such a valuable tool in the context of long-term disability claims? And are there particular conditions like ME/CFS or long COVID or fibromyalgia where it really proves especially helpful?
Sure. Josh, if you could go to the next slide, please. It's been long established that the measures that we get from a cardiopulmonary exercise test, again, which are objective, not self-report measures, not something you can fake when you do the test. One of the measures that we get is called VO2 max or VO2 peak. VO stands for volume of oxygen consumed at peak effort. And we also refer to that as the aerobic capacity. And there's a very strong and well-established relationship between aerobic capacity or VO2 max and illness status. And the other thing that we've learned over many studies, and I can show you, I might be able to show you some. I can't remember if I put that slide in or not, but there are many studies that have shown that CPET measurements are valid and reproducible in a variety of illness populations, as well as healthy individuals, even low fit and healthy, if you can be both of those at the same time, but certainly in athletes, but in heart disease patients, patients with cystic fibrosis, all sorts of disease statuses that you can do a test on one day and come back and have them do a test on the next day. They may not like it, but they can reproduce the results. That is not what we're finding, particularly in people who have ME/CFS or long COVID. And so that makes the CPET measurement a very valuable objective indicator, and also a means of establishing whether somebody is recovering normally following an exertional stressor on the first day. Also, Social Security Disability recognizes an abnormal exercise test as evidence of a medically defined impairment, so medically determined impairment.
Yeah, so that's important. I also do Social Security disability work, and one of the first things you have to prove in Social Security is that you have a medically determinable impairment. So the fact that this test is recognized really helps us get over the question of whether, in fact, a person has a determinable impairment. It's not so much an issue, I think, in the context of long-term disability. What the issue is is not so much diagnosis, it's what is the person's functional, physical and cognitive restrictions and limitations. And as you know, most patients with these conditions will struggle with credibility because of their symptoms and feeling that doctors or people don't necessarily believe them. Can you touch a little bit more on how the CPET really objectively validates their functional limitations?
Sure. If you want to, why 2 CPETs for fatiguing illness here? I'll just preface this by saying that in 2015, the Institute of Medicine, which is now the National Academy of Medicine, produced a report in which they recognized the value of CPET, a 2-day CPET, to support or provide objective evidence of post-exertional malaise. And that's, I'm just going to say that's a key point here, because oftentimes we have people who are looking for a diagnostic. We are not a diagnostic. This test allows us to show evidence of impaired recovery, which is part and parcel of post-exertional malaise. So what you see here is, the 2-day protocol, which shows us that the first test is important for us to establish your aerobic capacity, or your baseline ability to use oxygen to produce energy to do work. And it also allows us to assess what's called your anaerobic threshold. And that's the point during incremental or graded exercise when you start to produce more energy without the availability of oxygen. So we have several ways of producing energy, 3 ways. And most of the time you're using oxygen to produce energy. We are right now, as we're sitting down doing this conversation, sitting at your desk doing work, walking around at a normal speed. All of those kinds of activities are aerobic activities. But also, running a 10K race, if you're fit for that, can be an aerobic activity. But at some point, even for the athlete, if you push yourself a little bit harder, or you need energy produced very quickly, oxygen-derived energy production is a slow process. So if you need energy, for example, to run out of a burning building, you need energy very quickly to be successful at getting out of the building. And we can do that, but it doesn't require oxygen for that. So that we call that anaerobic or without oxygen energy production. And when you start to produce energy anaerobically, there's a shift in the data that we see during an exercise test. And it's a pivotal point for us because what we've learned with these fatiguing illnesses is when people begin to exceed that threshold called the anaerobic threshold, that it seems to provoke their symptoms of PEM. So if we can establish objectively when that happens or what heart rate it corresponds to when you exceed that threshold or change in energy production, shift in energy production, then what we can do is advise you, guide you to be able to try to stay below that level of effort at which you're going to exacerbate your illness symptoms. So we can learn that from the first test. And then presumably the first test provokes your post-exertional response because we force you to exercise above that threshold. And then when you come back the next day for the second test, everybody else can reproduce it. Remember, cardiac patients, pulmonary patients, they can all reproduce it on the second day. But if you have post-exertional malaise that interferes with your ability to use oxygen to produce energy, and we measure how much that interference is impacting your function. So when you come back on the second day, we measure your aerobic capacity again. We measure your anaerobic threshold again. And we also look at a whole host of other things. And I'll point out here that all of those measurements that we're taking with the blood pressure cuff and allows us to look at a variety of different things that relate to your ability to move blood around with oxygen to get it where it needs to go, not just your muscles, but your brain and all of your tissues. So that second test is critically important.
And that's a fantastic explanation of the 2-day CPET, but it also leads to the question and issues that we both get, and that is the concern I hear is that the CPET exam can be physically demanding. The traveling to get to the CPET facility in and of itself, the actual testing itself, the second day of testing. And there's always this concern that we are exacerbating our client, your patient's risk of increasing their exertional malaise.
Sure.
And sometimes my clients will say, well, I don't want to do that because I'm never going to recover, if you will. So could you address, please, the issue of the impact of travel, the impact of the CPET, and whether any increased malaise is permanent?
Sure. There was a study produced by an internal study, an intramural study produced by the National Institutes of Health a couple of years ago. And they queried people with myalgic encephalomyelitis about their symptoms. And they produced these sort of heat maps here. And what you see on the left side is what was described as the symptoms and the severity of the symptoms that they experience daily associated with post-exertional malaise. So you can see that exhaustion is first and foremost there. Difficulty thinking, so cognitive dysfunction of some sort, pain, those are the three that kind of stand out. Those are the biggies there. If you look on the right side of the screen, you'll see the symptoms that they describe following a cardiopulmonary exercise test. And they don't look terribly different. You still see pain. That might be a little bit more amplified. Exhaustion is about the same. Cognitive function is probably impacted more after the exercise protocol compared to their daily PEM. But you can see that they're not hugely different, that the symptoms might be amplified for a period of time, but they're not different. I also will add at this point too, especially if somebody's thinking about, we've had people travel to New York City and then come up to us for the exercise test. They've gone to New York City maybe to get the neurocognitive battery done or to get a tilt table test done, and then they come to Ithaca for the 2-day test, and they're trying to get it all done in one fell swoop, and that is not a great idea. I've had many people we've tested who say that they are more PEM'd, quote unquote, after the neurocognitive battery than after the 2-day test.
Wow.
And I've also heard the same about the tilt test. The tilt, not the poor man's tilt test, the NASA lean test, but a tilt table test. And so it can vary in how you respond to these tests. But Josh, if you can put the next slide up, I'll show you a little bit of data that we have about recovery. And so how long does it take to recover following a 2-day CPET? We recently completed a 5-year NIH-funded study, and we tracked symptoms. And again, it was self-report, but symptoms were rated for at least 10 days following the 2-day CPET and longer, because we wanted to see how long it would take for the people who did the 2-day CPET to get back to their baseline state. So this is the second study. It says 10 to 12 days. There were 80 people reported in the study by Moore and others, and 10 to 12 days on average was what over 90%, I think over 95% of the people took to recover. Some recovered in less. Data from the Workwell Foundation at the top there, where they track their recovery times, show that most of everybody recovers that they've tested recover in 4 to 7 days. And the study that we have that's in review right now, where we had people wearing an accelerometer, an activity monitor, is showing that it was pretty consistent with what we reported with the NIH study, about 8 to 10 days. And this is back to their pre-test baseline state, okay? More than 90%, and I'll even say 95% based on the data collectively from these 3 studies, were recovered within 1 to 2 weeks. Okay. There is a nucleus of activity that's been out on the internet for some time with some people who claim that they did not recover, but that's not what we're experiencing.
Okay, great. Now, I have my own thoughts about this question, but I'm going to ask it to you
Sure.
Anyway. As a practitioner, how do you believe the CPET results are received by disability insurance companies and plans? And have you seen a growing recognition of this data in disability claims, or is there some continuing resistance?
Far less resistance than there used to be. 15 years ago, 20 years ago, writing these reports, I mean, you would provide the subjective evidence, and if they got an independent medical examiner, physician to say, well, but I think this.
Right. Which they do all the time.
That's all it took, even though here we have the objective evidence. And when I say a plethora of data out there, that we're talking many, many, many decades of data showing the objectivity of cardiopulmonary exercise testing. If a doc said, but I think in my professional opinion, blah, 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 then, the insurance companies were looking for any little thing to latch on to, and the heck with it. And I've also had IMEs, write their reports where they've reviewed all the medical records of the individual and talked about the cognitive function test, et cetera, et cetera. And they said, and Keller did a 2-day test, boop, next paragraph. And that was it. Seriously, I'm not joking. And there was no comment about it, because what are they going to say? And that's kind of where we're at now. It's like, you can't refute it, because we all have seen it around long enough. We've learned about it long enough. And there's, decades of data out there on cardiac and pulmonary patients. So it's become more and more difficult to refute a cardiopulmonary exercise test data. And so we are seeing it be more impactful than it's ever been before. That said, we'll still get the IME report that says, in my professional opinion, blah, blah, blah. And sometimes I'm asked to write a rebuttal to that. And then I just dig back into the data and I pull out the studies and I explain again what this means and refute some of the most ridiculous statements I've ever heard made about cardiopulmonary exercise testing that are just blatantly incorrect, and refute that. And I submit a rebuttal letter. But it's become much more impactful and accepted than it was certainly 15 years ago.
And that's been my experience. I mean, we always argue that the CPET is scientifically valid and reliable, and physicians should be hard pressed to challenge both its validity and its reliability. So,
yes, and Josh, if you want to move to the next slide, I'll just I forgot that I did put that in there. So let's take a quick look at that. And this, I know it's a lot of small print here, but basically what you're looking at is a table that was produced by the Workwell Foundation a while ago, and it's showing a bunch of different studies with different patient populations. So you've got on the far left, you've got sedentary individuals, and it's showing the variability from or the reproducibility of tests in various measures that we typically look at during an exercise, a cardiopulmonary exercise test. So those measures are down the left side of the chart there. Across the top are the different studies, and across the very bottom are, we have, as I said, sedentary people on the left, trained individuals next to that, and a bunch of different diseases represented in the studies through the middle to the right of the table there. And the variability, if you can read those numbers, is small. It's within 7% that you should be able to reproduce your aerobic capacity or your VO2 max from test 1 to test 2. And in many studies, it's even smaller than that. So we kind of use 7% as our cutoff when we do these tests for determining whether somebody reproduced their peak oxygen consumption.
I'm learning so much, but I think we need to take a break.
Sure.
So we'll be back in a second with more information about best practices and advice about CPETs.
Are you a professional with questions about your individual disability policy? You need the Disability Insurance Claim Survival Guide for Professionals. This book gives you a comprehensive understanding of your disability policy, with tips and to-dos that will assist you in submitting a winning disability application. This is one you don't want to miss. For the next 24 hours, we're giving away free copies of the Disability Insurance Claim Survival Guide for Professionals. Order yours today at disabilityclaimsforprofessionals.com.